Mara did not sleep the night she found the wolf. She had been awake since 3 in the morning, lying flat on her back in the dark, staring at the ceiling the way she had done on too many nights to count, since she had moved alone to the old homestead at the edge of Greystone Ridge. Sleep had never come easily to her, not even in childhood, and here on the ridge it was worse in the winters when the wind had nothing to soften it and came straight down from the high country with a sound like something being torn. She had learned to live inside that restlessness. She had organized it. She kept a lantern by the door, a journal on the nightstand, and she had discovered that 3 in the morning, when everything in the world was flat and still and unavoidable, was sometimes the best time to think clearly about things she spent the daylight hours refusing to face. That night, she had been thinking about money. Not in a panicked way. Not anymore. She had moved past panic about money in her first winter on the ridge, which had been brutal in a way she had not prepared for. And what had replaced panic was something more like a steady reckoning. She knew the numbers. She knew which months were tight and which had room. She knew what the homestead required and what she could put off, and what could not be put off without consequences. It was not a comfortable way to live, but it was an honest one, and she had discovered in her 2 years on the ridge that she preferred honesty over comfort in most circumstances. She was in the middle of this when she heard something that made her stop thinking entirely. Not a threatening sound. She could not have explained then or later why she was so certain of that. She was a person who paid attention to her own reactions, who had spent enough solitary months reading the ridge's sounds to know which ones tightened her chest and which ones did not. This did not tighten her chest. It was a sound that made her sit up in bed and go very still, the particular stillness of someone who does not want to interrupt something. Deep and low and steady, coming from the direction of the back fence, the old cedar posts her grandfather had set in the earth 4 decades ago, when this land was more of a working farm and less of the quiet, tired thing she had inherited. She pulled her coat on over her nightclothes. She found her boots by feel. She lit the lantern and went out. The cold met her at the door like something that had been waiting. It was early October, and Greystone Ridge had already decided that autumn was a courtesy it did not intend to extend much further. Her breath made small, quick clouds. The lantern threw its gold ring outward across the frozen grass, and she walked the path she knew by feel and repetition, past the corner of the barn, past the water trough with its new skin of ice at the edges, along the fence of the chicken run, and down toward the long back fence where her land ended, and the high timber began, and the dark was as complete as dark gets when there are no lights for miles, and the sky above is clear and starry and enormous. She stopped. He was at the fence. He was on the other side, in the shadow of the trees, in the dark that her lantern barely reached. And the lantern did reach, just barely, just enough, and in that thin gold light she saw him, and did not move, and did not breathe for a moment that seemed longer than moments usually are. She had seen wolves before, once, at a wildlife education center 2 counties south, where a small family of them lived behind high fencing and came out for public viewing hours on weekends. She had stood at the fence there too, looking through the chain links at animals that were clearly wolves, clearly large, clearly impressive, and she had understood why people came to see them. But she had not felt anything in her chest then, the way she felt something in her chest now, looking at this one. He was enormous. The word came to her first and did not leave. His shoulders rose to the level of the cedar post rail. His coat was the color that silver actually is before it tarnishes, a clean, layered gray that caught the lantern light at the tips of each strand and held it, so that he seemed to carry his own faint glow. He was perfectly still, not the stillness of an animal that has frozen in alarm, not the stillness of something preparing to move, but the stillness of something that has chosen to be exactly where it is. He was looking at her. Not the way animals usually looked at people, sidelong, always with an escape route already mapped, the gaze brief and scanning, and fundamentally elsewhere. He was looking at her directly. His eyes were amber, almost the gold of good honey, and they were clear and calm, and very attentive. She did not look away. She could not. She did not want to. She did not know how long they stood there. Long enough that her feet went cold inside her boots. Long enough that the lantern wick flickered from the slight wind coming down off the ridge. Long enough that she began to feel, slowly and without alarm, that something was happening that she did not have a word for, that this moment was not ordinary, and she should not let herself treat it as ordinary. Then he turned, He turned without hurry, without the startled bolt that wild things usually make when they leave, and he walked into the trees and the dark and was gone. Mara stood at the fence. She was not scared. She was also not calm in any ordinary sense. She was something more complex than either of those things, something that needed more time and more words than she had available at 3 in the morning in the cold. She walked back to the house and set the lantern on the kitchen table, and sat down in her coat, and wrapped both hands around a glass of water she did not heat and did not drink. The sky outside the window went from black to the particular blue that comes just before gray. She had not thought about money once since she heard the sound. She went back to the fence in the morning. The ground on her side was hard and dry and showed nothing. But the cedar post at the far corner, the one she always noticed because it leaned slightly to the left, the one she had been meaning to straighten for a year, the one her grandfather had probably set crooked because he was in a hurry, and her grandmother had probably never stopped noting it, had something caught in its rough surface. Just above the middle rail, where the cedar had split and dried and roughened with age into a texture like deep bark, there were tufts of fur, silver gray, dense and layered. She reached out and touched them before she pulled them free, and the softness of them surprised her. She would not have guessed that fur so thick could be that soft. She pulled them free carefully, the way she handled anything that seemed worth handling carefully, and held them in her palm. They were warm. She looked at the post, which was cold. She looked at the morning, which was cold. She looked at her palm, where the fur sat and was warm, and she stood with it for a while without trying to explain it. She did not ask herself why she kept them. The decision was made before she could have called it a decision. She walked back to the house and put the strands on the kitchen table and made her breakfast, and looked at them while the coffee brewed and the toast browned. And when she was done eating, she carried them to her workroom, where she kept her sewing supplies and her fabrics and the old pillow forms she had been restuffing in the evenings, as a small project to keep her hands busy through the cold weeks ahead. She was making herself a new pillow. Nothing special. A cover from a remnant of gray linen she had found at the small fabric shop in town. Good fabric, heavy and well woven, in a color that she had always found calming, in the way that the color of winter skies is calming. She had cut the cover and sewn 3 sides and not yet decided how to close the 4th. She sat at her small work table and held the strands of wolf fur between her fingers, and she began to braid them. Slowly, with the unhurried care she brought to all handwork. 3 strands over each other in the simple pattern she had learned as a girl and never stopped using, for her hair, for bundles of dried herbs, for lengths of rope and ribbon. The braid was neat and dense, the silver strands catching the weak morning light from the workroom window. When it was the length she wanted, she worked it into the open seam of the pillow cover, stitching it in at regular intervals so it lay flat and would not shift. She finished the pillow that afternoon, and stuffed it, and sewed the 4th side closed. That night, she slept until 6 in the morning without waking once. She lay there afterward in the gray light and thought about this. 6 in the morning was not unusual for her. She was an early riser, had always been, but sleeping through was unusual. She could not remember the last time she had not surfaced at some point in the dark to check that she was still herself, to reckon with whatever the middle of the night chose to present. She had slept cleanly, without interruption, and woken into the morning without any of the low dragging weight that usually accompanied her through the first hour of the day. She made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window, and looked at the back fence. Nothing there, only the tree line and the slightly leaning cedar post, and the sky going pink at the edges over the ridge. She was not disappointed. She was the kind of person who had learned, through trial and considerable error, that wanting something too directly usually meant you stopped being able to see it clearly, and she was not going to want the wolf in a way that made her foolish about it. She was going to be patient. She was very good at patient. She had a neighbor named Owen, who ran the farm 2 miles down the road, and who had been on the ridge his entire life. He was in his early 60s, tall and deliberate in his movements, with hands that looked like maps of everything he had ever done. They had a friendship that had built itself on practical exchange. He brought extra eggs in the summer when his hens were generous. She gave him tomatoes, and once, memorably, helped him untangle 60 feet of irrigation tubing that had developed opinions of its own. They talked sometimes for a long time at the fence between their properties and sometimes not at all, and both kinds of visits were equally fine. It was Owen who had mentioned the pack a few days before, in passing, the way he mentioned everything of importance, without emphasis, trusting her to catch it. He had said the gray wolves had moved higher this season. Usually they stayed in the dense timber north of the ridge road, 4 or 5 miles from her property. But their range had shifted, and the silver male had been seen near several farms on the south side of the ridge over the summer. Owen had said this without alarm. He had a clear-eyed respect for the pack, built on decades of observation, and his only practical comment was that he had not had any trouble with them and did not expect to. "He's not aggressive?" she had asked. "Never," Owen had said. "He just watches. Has for years, the ones I've seen him. He just comes to the edge and watches and goes." She had held on to this detail without knowing why. She saw the wolf 3 more times in October, always at dusk or in the early grayness before full dawn, always at the back fence, always in the same attitude of complete and unhurried stillness, looking at her with those amber eyes that she had started thinking about during the day at unexpected moments, while she was mending a broken chicken wire panel, while she was dragging branches from the last windfall to the burn pile, while she was sitting at the kitchen table with her accounts. Every time, 1 or 2 days after each visit, she found fur on the cedar post. She collected every strand. She added them to the pillow in the evenings, working by the light of the wood stove, braiding the new strands into the ones already there, stitching them in carefully along the seam and down one side. It had become a kind of ritual without her naming it as such. She was not a person who named her rituals. She just did them, the way she did the morning coffee and the evening journal, because they had weight and because they were hers. The pillow was changing as she added to it. Not in any visible way. It still looked like a plain gray linen pillow, but it felt different in her hands, slightly heavier, warmer in a way that she told herself was about the wood stove and the wool batting, and not about anything else. She slept on it every night, and slept well every night, and did not examine this correlation too directly. She told Owen about the wolf's visits, not about the pillow. "Curious about the new person," she said. Owen looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes did. Not long, just a beat. Just enough to let her know there was more to say that he had decided not to say. "Probably," he said. She let it go. Owen was entitled to his pauses. The temperature dropped sharply in the second week of October. She spent her evenings by the stove with her journal open and her tea going cold while she wrote in it. She had always been an honest journal keeper. She wrote what she noticed without softening it, that she was still carrying grief about her mother, that the grief had a different texture now than it had in the city, less sharp, more like weather, like something she moved through rather than something that stopped her, that she was genuinely happy in a way she had not expected and still felt slightly guilty about, as though happiness after loss required more of a passage of time than 2 years, that the ridge had given her back something she had not known she was missing before she came here, something she could only describe as the sense of being in the right place. She wrote one night, in early November, a single line that she put at the bottom of the page as though she was not quite sure it belonged with the other things. "I don't know what it is, but I feel watched over here, not in a frightening way, in the way that makes you less afraid of everything else." She did not know what she had brought into her house. She did not know that on the other side of the ridge, a man named Cale sat in the long hours before dawn, at the edge of the high meadow, and looked south, and thought about a small lit window and a woman who walked her fence line at dawn without fear, and that the threads she had taken from that cedar post had been left with full and careful intention, and that he had gone back and counted what remained, every time, because it was the only way he had to know whether anything he did had meaning. She had no idea. She slept with the pillow every night, and every night she slept well, and November came down over Greystone Ridge, with cold purpose, and bare trees, and the sound of the creek dropping in volume, as the stones froze, and she was patient, and she was grateful, and she was ready for whatever the winter had in mind. She was not ready for the letter. The first week of November brought the kind of cold that announced itself in the body before the thermometer confirmed it. The particular bite in the air that was qualitatively different from October cold, deeper and more committed. The cold that understood it had months ahead of it and was not rushing anything. Mara had spent the last 2 weeks of October moving through her preparation list in order, working methodically from the most urgent item to the least. She had banked straw bales along the south foundation wall. She had wrapped the exposed pipes under the kitchen with foam lagging. She had stacked the last of the season's firewood in the covered lean-to, split and organized by size, the largest rounds at the back and the kindling nearest the door. She had replaced the heating element in the horse trough. She had added extra bedding to the chicken coop and checked the ventilation and patched the small gap in the northeast corner where a board had warped over the summer. She had done all of this alone, which was not remarkable to her, because she had done everything alone for 2 years and had stopped thinking of alone as a condition that required comment. Owen came by on a cold morning in early November and walked around the property with her, in the way he did at the turn of each season, looking at what had been done with the particular eye of someone who had seen this land through 40 winters. He nodded at the firewood, said nothing about the straw bales, because that had been his suggestion in the first place, and he was not a man who needed to be acknowledged for his suggestions, and paused at the back fence corner to look at the cedar post that still leaned to the left. "Going to fix that?" he said. "Planning to," she said. "Spring." He made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement. They went inside, and she made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about the coming winter, about his cattle and her chickens, about the creek, and how high it would likely come in the snowmelt in April. He told a story about his father and a winter in this area that had taken out power for 3 weeks, and she told him something she had not told anyone else, about the winter her mother died and how she had spent it in a city apartment with the blinds down, which was not how she had wanted to spend it, but had not known how to do anything different at the time. Owen listened. He was good at listening the way some people are good at silence, not simply tolerating it, but being genuinely comfortable inside it. When she finished, he said, quietly, that grief had its own seasons, and most people did not give it enough of them. After he left, she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the back fence. The cedar post was empty, no fur this week. The wolf had not come in 5 days, and she had made a note of this in the margin of her journal, which she noticed only afterward and felt a brief but genuine embarrassment about, not enough to erase it, which said something, though she did not linger on what. She was patient. She was good at patient. She knew this about herself. The envelope appeared under the front door on a Thursday morning. She almost stepped on it coming downstairs in the dark at 5. It was a plain white envelope with her name written on the front, in a careful, unfamiliar handwriting that was neither masculine nor feminine, just neat and deliberate. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the Greystone County Land Office letterhead at the top, and 3 dense paragraphs below it that she read standing in the kitchen in her socks, in the dark, before she turned on any lights, because she could not make herself wait even the 30 seconds it would take to reach the light switch. A company called Meridian Land Holdings had filed a development application with the county. They were seeking approval to acquire and clear approximately 800 acres of forested land along the north-facing slope of the ridge corridor, the timber that bordered her property from the northeast corner of the back fence all the way along the ridge line. The application had already moved through the initial review phase. A public comment period was open. There was a meeting date and a form number and a list of documents available for review at the county office. At the bottom of the page, in the same careful handwriting that was on the envelope, someone had written 4 words, "Thought you should know." No signature. Mara sat down at the kitchen table. She read the letter a second time and a third time, and then she set it flat on the table and looked at it in the particular way she looked at things she did not yet know what to do with. The wood stove was cold. The house was cold. The sky outside the window was still black. She thought about the trees. She had been in them enough by then to know them. She had hiked their edges in her first summer and walked their inner paths in autumn, had photographed fungi and mosses, and the particular quality of the light that came through old canopy at midday. There were cedars on the north face that were older than anything she had seen outside of books, older certainly than her grandmother, possibly older than the homestead itself. There were 3 species of owl in those trees. There were deer trails that had been worn into the earth so long and by so many generations of deer that they had the character of small roads. The creek that crossed her property began in the watershed those trees maintained. If the watershed was broken, the creek followed. She called Owen at 6:30. He was already awake and already knew. He had received the same letter, and he told her, in the calm voice he used when he was very controlled, about something that required control, that Meridian was not an unknown entity in this part of the state. They had bought and cleared land 3 times in the past 5 years. They worked legally, which was the thing that made them difficult to stop, and they worked quickly, which was the thing that made them dangerous. He told her she needed to engage a land use attorney before the comment period closed. and he gave her the name of a woman in town named Clara who had done this kind of work before, and who was honest. "We fight it," Mara said. "Yes," Owen said. "We do." She spent the next 3 days doing things she had not done before. She filed a public comment using the form number from the letter. She called Clara, who had a voice that was dry and precise, and deeply reassuring in the way that someone who knows exactly what they are talking about is always reassuring. Clara told her the application was not approved, that the comment period mattered, and that the environmental impact assessment Meridian had submitted was thin for a project of this scale and might have real procedural vulnerabilities if someone looked at it carefully enough. "Have you done surveys of the timber on your side of the boundary?" Clara asked. "Photographs?" Mara said. "I have a lot of photographs." "Good," Clara said. "Get more. As much documentation as you can of what's in that tree line. Species diversity, water features, soil, animal evidence. We need to build a picture." Mara went out the next morning with her camera and spent 3 hours in the timber before the light got too low and flat to be useful. She photographed everything she could name, and some things she could not. She photographed the creek inlet, where it came off the slope onto her property, the dark soil at the tree line edge, the deer trails, the owl pellets she found at the base of a cedar snag, the old growth section in the northeast corner, where the trees were so tall that she had to tip her head back at a painful angle to find their tops. She also photographed the cedar post with its slight lean to the left, and the place above the middle rail where the bark was roughened and split, though she did not include this in the folders she organized for Clara. That photograph went into a different folder. She labeled the folder without quite deciding to, "Found Things." The next several weeks were among the most demanding she had experienced since the first winter, but in a different way. The first winter had demanded physical endurance, learning by doing, making mistakes in real time, failing at things and trying again and failing differently. This demanded a different kind of stamina. She was reading documents late into the evenings. She was on the phone with Clara several times a week, learning a vocabulary she had not needed before. She was attending county meetings and sitting through hours of procedural language that was clearly designed to be impenetrable to ordinary people, and she was fighting, quietly and consistently, the urge to feel overwhelmed by it. She did not feel overwhelmed. She felt, underneath the fatigue and the frustration, something that was almost anger, which was useful, and something under that which was love, which was more useful still. She loved the timber. She loved the creek. She loved the old cedars and the deer trails and the watershed, and the particular cold smell of those trees on a November morning, when the first snow was in the air. She had only known for 2 years that she loved these things, but that was long enough. The wolf came twice in November. She found fur both times. She added what she found to the pillow and noticed, one evening as she worked, that the braided strands had grown into something that was more than decorative. They had become structural, part of the pillow itself, threaded through the batting, woven into the shape. She had been doing this without planning it, and the result was something she had not intended to make. She held it in her hands and looked at it for a while. She slept on it that night and the night after, and every night she could think of. The night before the first major county hearing, she could not sleep at all. She lay in the dark, and the dread found her the way it always found her, before things she could not fully control. Not as a sharp fear, but as a low and persistent pressure, the weight of all the things that might go wrong pressing down on her chest from above. She breathed. She counted her breath. She pressed her face against the pillow, and held it there, and felt the particular warmth of it, the strange, consistent warmth that had nothing to do with the room temperature. At some point past midnight, she heard the sound. She was at the window before she had consciously decided to move. He was at the fence. In the snow that had just begun, thin and dry, the first proper snow of the season, the silver wolf stood at the post and looked at her window, and the flakes settled on his coat and did not melt immediately, which meant he had been there long enough to be cold. She pressed her hand flat against the glass. The glass was cold, and she held her hand there anyway. He did not move for a long time. She went back to bed. She slept for 4 hours. She drove to the county hearing in the morning, and spoke clearly when it was her turn, and said everything she needed to say, without shaking and without rushing. Clara told her afterward that she had done well. She drove home through the first real snow of the season, which was coming down properly now, and when she got out of the truck, she went to the cedar post before she went inside. There was more fur than she had ever found at once. Long strands, many of them, moving slightly in the cold air. She gathered every one of them. She held them against her chest with both arms and walked to the house like that, and she sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes without taking her coat off, just sitting with the fur in her hands and the snow coming down outside the window and the house quiet around her. She did not braid anything that night. She just sat with it. She thought about the hearing. She thought about Clara's procedural argument, which was not a certain thing, but was a real thing. She thought about Owen's steady voice on the phone. She thought about the old cedars on the north face of the slope, and the creek, and the watershed. She thought about amber eyes in the dark. She thought, I don't know what you are giving me, but I know that I needed it, and you knew that before I did. She went to bed with the fur gathered loose in her palm, and the pillow at her face, and she slept. She did not know that on the north side of the ridge, a man named Cale had gone to the post 3 times in the weeks since the survey stakes appeared, and left everything he had each time, and that he had checked twice since and found nothing remaining, and that the nothing remaining was the thing that let him breathe. The fire started at 12:40 in the morning on the 14th of December. Mara smelled it before she saw any light from it, and she smelled it while she was still asleep, or mostly asleep. The particular sharp, dry wrongness of it cutting through the ordinary smell of the house and the cold night, and landing her in full wakefulness so fast that she sat up before she was entirely certain she was awake. She did not sit up slowly. She sat up and she was on her feet by the time her eyes found the window, and through the back window she could see the orange light, distant but certain, pressed against the dark of the tree line. She did not spend any time processing it. She called the fire department as she was pulling on her boots and her coat, and gave her address, and the location of the fire, and the wind direction, and then she put the phone in her coat pocket and went out. The fire was at the south edge of the timber, the edge that bordered her back fence. Not on her property yet, but the wind was coming from the north, and the timber was dry, and the gap between the tree line and her barn was 40 feet at the closest point, and she did not have time to think about what would happen if the gap closed. The horses. She went to them first because she was thinking clearly, and the horses were the thing that could not move themselves. Fern, her older bay mare, came out of her stall with the quiet obedience that was the reward of 17 years of trust. Mara had the lead rope clipped and the door open in 15 seconds, and Fern walked with her through the barn and out the far door, and around to the north side of the house, where Mara tied her to the heavy porch rail and told her she was a good horse, which she was. Slate was different. He was 3 years old and still learning that the world did not need to frighten him, and the world was currently doing nothing to support this lesson. She could hear him before she reached his stall, the sharp thudding of hooves against the wall, the rhythmic sound of an animal past ordinary alarm and into something more primal. She stood at his stall door for a long moment and breathed, and made her body do what it needed to do, which was be calm, be still, be the most settled thing in his immediate experience. She spoke to him in the low, continuous way she used when he was bad. Not sentences, just tone, the sound of something unafraid. She got the halter on him in 40 seconds, which was twice what it usually took and half what it should have taken in those conditions. She got the stall door open, and he came through it in a rush that she moved with rather than against, steering rather than restraining, and they came out of the barn in a controlled mess, and she kept her feet and got him around to the north side and tied him next to Fern, and stood with her hand on his neck for a full minute until his breathing began to come down. The chickens she released from the coop and drove into the yard, reasoning that the open air was better than a closed structure if the smoke came thick. The rabbit she put in the small carrying crate, kept in the barn for this purpose, and set it on the porch, on the north side, away from the south wind. She was crossing the yard back toward the barn to do a final check when she saw movement at the fence that was not the fire. She stopped moving. He came through the fence rails, between them, with a fluid ease that she would think about for weeks afterward, the way something that large moved through a space that should not have accommodated it, as though the rules of solidity were suggestions he had already negotiated with. He crossed the yard in long, unhurried strides that covered the ground faster than they looked like they should, and she opened her mouth to shout because Slate was terrified, and a wolf crossing the yard toward him would. But he did not go toward the horses. He went to them, yes, but to the side of them, between them and the south, positioning himself between the animals and the direction of the fire, and he went still. Fern, who was 17 years old and had never been within 100 feet of a wild predator, pressed her nose toward him and then stood quietly and dropped her head slightly, which was what Fern did when she was at ease. Slate, who was frightened of plastic sheeting and unexpected shadows, looked at the silver wolf for a long and searching moment. Then he stopped trembling. Mara stood in the yard and looked at all three of them in the orange light from the south, the snow coming down now more heavily, and the only thing she could think clearly was, "You came." She had to move. The wind shifted hard and the smoke came, acrid and dense, and she turned and went to the house for the box she had prepared months ago that held the important documents. The deed, her insurance policy, the hard drive from her laptop. Clara had told her to keep it accessible, and she had, and she went through the front door and grabbed it from the shelf by the door and came back out and put it in the truck. The fire trucks arrived, and the noise and the light expanded, and there were people in high-visibility vests asking her questions, and she answered them clearly because she was still thinking clearly. She was still thinking clearly in the way she did when things were actually happening, all of the thinking available, and very focused, and no room for anything outside the immediate. She told the crew chief what she knew. She pointed at the fence line and the gap, she showed him the barn, and answered his questions about the structure. At some point, she turned around. The wolf was 6 feet from her. She did not know when he had moved from the horses to this position. She had not heard him cross the yard. But he was there, standing in the falling snow, and the fire truck headlights were sweeping the yard and catching him in intermittent flashes of white that made him look like something from a story she had not yet read, and his amber eyes were on her face. She walked toward him. She crossed those 6 feet, and she reached out her hand, and she touched his jaw. The fur was thick there, dense and warm under her fingers, and she could feel his breath going in and out, and she could feel under the fur and the muscle the particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of something frozen, but the stillness of something choosing, of something that had already decided and was simply waiting to be acknowledged. She was crying, and she had not known she was crying until she felt the cold of her tears and understood they had been there for some time. She did not know why. Everything was fine. The fire line was holding. Her animals were safe. The snow was coming harder and helping, covering the dry brush south of the fence, and she could hear the crew working steadily, and the radio voices calling updates that she could not quite make out, but that had the tone of things going under control. She was fine. She knew she was fine. She cried anyway, and she did not look away from him, and he did not look away from her, and for a long moment that had no proper measure, there were just two living things looking at each other fully, with nothing held back on either side. Then a truck shifted, and the headlights swept hard across the yard, and she blinked into the white of it, and when her eyes found him again, he was at the fence line, and then he was through it, and then he was gone. She stood in the yard. One of the crew came over and asked if she was hurt, and she said no. She was not hurt. She was completely fine. She answered a few more questions from the crew chief, and gave her contact information, and watched the fire department work with the focused efficiency of people who had done this many times and knew how each step connected to the next. The snow helped. By 2 in the morning, the fire was contained, and by 3 it was out, and the crew left one truck parked at the edge of the property until dawn to watch for any renewed heat in the brush. She sat on the porch and looked at the snow coming down. She sat there for a long time. In the morning, the fire was a black scar along the south fence line. The barn was untouched. The house was untouched. The cedar post still stood at the corner of the back fence, slightly leaning, patient as it had always been. Fern and Slate were in the paddock, looking ordinary and unconcerned, the way horses look the morning after crisis, as though the crisis is already irrelevant to the business of being horses. Mara went to the cedar post. She stood there for a moment in the ash smell and the cold and the snow that was still coming, in light, thin layers, and then she looked at the post. More fur than she had ever found there. By a great deal. Long strands, thick and layered, so many of them that they moved in the slight cold air, like something planted there with meaning. She took every one. She gathered them in both hands, and pressed them to her chest, and walked back to the house. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time with her hands flat on the gathered fur, and the morning light coming through the window, and the house quiet and warm around her, and she thought about amber eyes in the snow, and slate going still, and a hand pressed against cold glass at midnight, and a pillow that had been warmer than any room she had kept it in, and she felt the long accumulated weight of all of it, and she did not try to reduce it to something simpler than it was. She wrote in her journal later, in the afternoon when her hands had steadied. I don't know yet what any of this means, but I know that I have been watched over, and I know that the watching was never accidental, and I know that when the time comes to understand it fully, I will not be afraid. She was right about all three of those things. He came to her door on a Tuesday morning in early February. Winter had been what winter always was on Greystone Ridge, relentless and clarifying, the kind of cold that strips everything down to what actually matters and leaves the rest buried under snow for the season. Mara had worked through it the way she worked through everything, methodically, without complaint, starting at the top of her list and moving down it one item at a time. She had kept the stove going. She had kept the animals fed and healthy. She had kept up with Clara's requests for documentation and had driven twice to the county office in the small town at the base of the ridge to drop off materials that needed to be submitted in person. She had kept her evenings for her journal and her reading and the pillow on the bed, which she fell into at the end of each day with the gratitude of someone who has earned their rest. She had not seen the wolf since the night of the fire. She had found fur on the post twice more, in late December and once in January, less than before, as though the frequency had changed without stopping entirely. She had collected what was there. She had worked the strands into the pillow, which was now substantially different from the linen remnant she had started with in October. Heavier, more textured along its edges, carrying within it a record of months of small accumulations. She had a letter from her sister in the city that she had been meaning to answer for 3 weeks. She had a book on land use litigation that Clara had lent her, and that she was reading for the second time. She had a painting project in the kitchen that she had started and not finished. She had, in other words, the full texture of a life that kept requiring things of her, and she was giving those things what they required. She was not thinking about the door, so when the knock came, at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning in a winter that had not yet showed any sign of releasing its grip, she was simply walking from the kitchen to the workroom with a cup of tea, and the knock surprised her enough that she stopped and stood in the hallway for a moment, and then went to the front door. She opened it. The man on her porch was tall in the way that was undeniably noticeable even in the open air of a wide porch. He had dark hair, slightly long, pushed back from a face that was even featured in a way that took a moment to fully register, and along the left side of his jaw there was a scar, not recent, old and settled, and simply a part of how he looked. He was wearing a dark coat and heavy boots, and he was holding in one hand a small glass jar, unlabeled, filled with honey the color of deep amber, the color of late afternoon. His eyes were amber too. She noticed this at the same moment she noticed the honey. She noticed it the way she noticed details, directly, completely, filing them without deciding what to do with them yet. "I'm sorry to come without calling," he said. His voice was calm, and lower than she had expected, and she had a response to it that she registered and set aside. "I'm Cale. I have land on the north face of the ridge." "Mara," she said. "I know," he said. He paused for a fraction of a second, a pause she would think about later. "Owen told me your name. He told me about the Meridian situation. I've been dealing with something similar on my side, and I thought it might be useful to talk, if you were willing." She looked at him. She looked at the honey. "Where does the honey come from?" she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. Something more like recognition. "High meadow on the north face," he said. "I keep hives up there through the summer." She stepped back from the door and opened it wider. "Come in," she said. He sat at her kitchen table, and she made fresh coffee, and she asked him questions, and he answered them. He had been watching the Meridian situation from his side of the ridge for months. He had documentation she did not have, photographs of the old-growth section on the north face, which he said was more extensive than anything on her side of the boundary and would be significant for the environmental argument Clara was building. He had already spoken to the county once, informally, about the corridor as a whole, and he had a contact at the State Wildlife Agency who was aware of the application. "Why are you coming to me now?" she said. "If you've been dealing with this for months." "I didn't know you were dealing with it too, until Owen told me your name 2 weeks ago," he said, "and once I knew." He stopped and considered the sentence. I wanted to make sure I had something worth bringing before I came. She thought about this for a long time after he left. She thought about it while she was doing her afternoon chores, and while she was making her dinner, and while she was sitting by the stove with her tea. A person who waited to make sure they had something worth bringing. She could not think of many people she had met who operated that way. He came back Thursday with the photographs organized and printed. He came back the following Tuesday to review the county documents before the next scheduled meeting. By the third visit, she had noticed, without saying so, that he seemed to prefer tea to coffee, and she had switched. And he had noticed, without saying so, that she had noticed, and neither of them mentioned it. These were the small, quiet things that built up between people before they have names for what is building. The county process deepened. Clara's procedural challenge created real friction in Meridian's timeline. An additional environmental review was required, and then a supplemental review, and then a letter from the State Wildlife Agency citing the need for proper species surveying. This last development had a source that Mara only learned about gradually, through the specific details of which surveys were cited, and when they had been commissioned. They had been commissioned 2 years ago. She looked at Cale across her kitchen table when she understood this. He met her eyes steadily. "You knew this was coming," she said. "I suspected it was likely," he said. The land between the North Face and the Ridge Road had been sold twice in 3 years to holding companies. That kind of pattern has a direction. "So you commissioned species surveys." "I commissioned them without telling anyone why," he said, which meant the data existed without anyone knowing it might be needed. "That's why Clara's argument is as strong as it is," Mara said. He said nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. She was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about someone who saw something threatening from a long way off, and did not wait for it to arrive but began, quietly and without announcement, to build the case against it. Who did this without telling anyone, without needing anyone to know? "You could have told people," she said. 2 years ago, you could have organized something." "If I had," he said, "people would have spent 2 years afraid. The surveys would have felt like an alarm rather than evidence. I thought the evidence mattered more than the warning." She looked at him for a long time. "I do the same thing," she said. "Hold things alone." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Owen," he said. "He talks about you." She filed this information carefully and let it sit without pressing it, because Owen had never once mentioned Cale's name to her, and she wanted to understand why before she asked about it. February ended and March came in raw and stubborn, the way March came every year on the ridge, the cold still present but the light beginning its slow return. The county case continued. The hearings continued. She and Cale drove to them together, having discovered without discussion that sharing the drive made the hours of procedural language somewhat more bearable. She learned things about him in the unguarded way you learn things about someone in a car, that he had grown up on the ridge, had left for years, had come back because the distance from the place had never reduced the pull of it, that he was not good at small talk, but was very good at saying exactly the right thing at the moment that required exactly the right thing, that he laughed rarely, but when he did, it was a real laugh, not the performance of one, and it changed his face entirely. She told him things she had not told anyone on the ridge, that her mother had died 4 years ago, and she was still setting the grief down in pieces, that she had left the city on what most people in her life had considered an act of instability, and she had never once regretted it, that she was more fully herself here than she had been in any previous period of her life, which was both a good thing and a slightly strange one, since she was 34 and had believed until recently that she had known herself reasonably well for at least a decade. He listened with the quality of attention she had never experienced from anyone else, total, undivided, genuinely interested in what she was saying, rather than in what he might say when she finished. She had not known attention could feel like a gift until she was on the receiving end of it regularly. One evening in the first week of March, she was in her workroom, going through fabric samples, and he was sitting in the chair near the door in the way he had started doing, staying into the evening, no particular reason given or asked for, both of them having arrived without a discussion, at the understanding that he stayed because it was where he wanted to be, and she did not tell him to go because it was where she wanted him. The pillow was on the work table. She had taken it there to add the last of the January strands to it and had not yet put it back. She looked up from the fabric samples and saw him looking at the pillow. He had gone still, not the ordinary stillness of someone absorbed in thought. The specific stillness she had noticed early in their acquaintance and had not yet been able to categorize correctly, the kind that came from something more than concentration. "I made that in October," she said. "I found fur on the cedar post at the back fence, from the wolf who visits sometimes. I kept it and braided it into the pillow. I know it sounds strange, but it felt like the right thing to do." She said it directly because she was a person who said things directly when she had made up her mind to say them. He was still looking at the pillow. "How much did you find?" he said. His voice was very careful, very level. "It built up over months," she said. "I added to it after the fire, too. He left more than usual after the fire." She paused. "Have you seen him? The silver wolf? He comes to my fence line." Kale looked at her. She looked back at him. She understood in that moment, and the understanding was not like being told something, but like remembering something she had known, and set aside in a place she had not gone back to. It arrived whole, not in pieces. The amber eyes, the quality of the stillness, the way Slate had stopped trembling, the warmth that had no explanation in the temperature of the room. She did not say what she understood yet. She sat with it for a moment, the full weight of it, and let it settle.
"Kale,"
she said. He looked at her without looking away. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He told her slowly and carefully, the way someone tells a truth they have held alone long enough to know its weight and what it costs to put down. He told her about the pack and his place in it, what he was and had always been, the nature he had been born into, and spent his life learning to live honestly inside of. He told her about the ridge and the south boundary, and the night he had first come to the fence line, which was earlier than she knew. Earlier than the October night she had heard the sound and gone out with the lantern. He had first come in late summer, weeks before that night, before she had known he was there. He told her about the post, that the fur was not accidental, that he had chosen the post as a way to be present for her, in the only way he had available to him, the only way that would not require an explanation he could not yet give. He said it last after everything else, and when he said it, his voice was steady and low and without decoration. He had counted every strand she took. He had gone back each time and counted what remained and subtracted it from what had been there, and known, by the difference, what she had chosen to keep. He had done this every time, for months, because it was the only measure he had of whether she had noticed, whether something he had tried to give had been received. "How many total?" she said. He told her the number. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the pillow on the work table. She thought about October mornings at a cold fence post. She thought about a journal page of dates and absences. She thought about warm fur in cold hands on the morning that should not have had warmth in it. She thought about Slate going still, and a hand on cold glass, and crying in the snow without knowing why. She picked up the pillow and held it in her lap and looked at the gray linen cover and the braided silver lines worked into it, and she breathed. She held it for a long moment. Then she set it on the table between them. "You gave this to me," she said. "Yes," he said. "Before you knew me," she said. "Before I had any idea." "Yes," he said. And in the single word was the full weight of what it had been to carry this without saying it. She heard it. She was good at hearing what was underneath things. She looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. He would not look away. She understood this was part of who he was, the directness of it, the willingness to be fully seen when the moment required it, which was the same willingness he extended to her when she talked about things she had not talked about with anyone else. She thought about what it meant to be a person who saw something beautiful and kept it. She thought about the instinct that had said, "Keep this," on that cold October morning, with warm fur in her palm, and no reason available yet. She thought about every morning since October that she had woken up rested, every evening she had felt watched over, without understanding the watching. She thought about someone on the other side of the ridge, counting what she had taken as the only way to know that something between them was real. "You counted every one," she said, softly. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "You couldn't stop," she said. "No," he said. "I couldn't. Once I started, each one it was proof that you had been there, that you had noticed, that what I was trying to give was reaching you. I didn't have anything else." She understood this. She understood it with the clarity of someone who had spent months writing precise notes in journal margins for exactly the same reason. Not to prove something to anyone else, but to prove to herself that the things she felt were real and had happened. They were both people who kept records of what mattered. They had been doing the same work, in different languages, on opposite sides of the same ridge. She breathed. The surveys, she said. The timber on the north face. The fallen timber on the survey access road in November, that I heard about from Owen. He was quiet. You've been holding a line around this place, she said. I've been trying to, he said. For 2 years, she said. Yes, he said. For longer than that, in some ways. She thought about what it meant to hold a line around something you loved before you had the words to say what you loved about it, or why, before the person at the center of it even knew you existed. She thought about the kind of care that could not be explained yet, and so was simply offered, quietly, in the only forms available. She was not afraid. She had not been afraid of him once, in all the months she had been in his presence, in any of his forms. She thought about this. The complete and consistent absence of fear, and she knew it was important information. She had always believed the body knew things before the mind caught up, and her body had known from the beginning. I sleep well because of the pillow, she said. Genuinely and consistently better than I have in years. I don't know how to explain it, but it's been true every night since October. Something moved in his expression, something at the edges, a breaking open kind of thing, like ground softening after a very long freeze. I'm glad, he said, and she heard, underneath those 2 words, the whole long weight of the months that had made them true. She nodded once, slowly. She looked at the pillow on the table between them, and then she looked at him. I have more questions, she said. Many more. I know, he said. I'm going to need you to answer all of them. I will, he said. Every one, however long it takes. Outside, the March night was doing what March nights did on the ridge, being cold and dark and indifferent. And also, if you paid attention to it the way Mara paid attention to everything, just barely beginning to let the light back in. Stay, she said. I'll make more tea. He stayed. April came the way it always came to the ridge, slowly, unevenly, with thaw following freeze, and freeze following thaw, in a cycle that tested the patience of anyone who wanted spring to simply commit itself. Mara had been through 2 ridge Aprils and had learned not to argue with the season's indecision. You kept your fire going until you didn't need it anymore, and you watched the south-facing slopes for the first mud, and you waited. The county decision came on the 4th of April. Clara called her at 10:30 in the morning, while Mara was at the kitchen table with coffee, and the latest round of documentation she had been organizing for a follow-up meeting that was now, apparently, not going to be necessary. Clara's voice was dry and precise, as it always was, but there was something different in the pacing of it. The application has been denied, Clara said. Formally, the additional environmental review requirements were not met within the extension period, and the county board voted this morning, 4-1, to deny on environmental impact grounds. She paused, which was unusual for Clara, who did not typically pause. There is also a conservation easement being placed on the North Face corridor. The State Wildlife Agency pushed for it as a condition of the board's deliberation, 50 years minimum. Mara sat very still. 50 years, she said. Minimum, Clara said. After they finished the call, Mara sat at the table for a long time. She thought about 50 years. She thought about the old cedars, and what 50 years meant for a tree that had already been standing for 150. The particular math of survival when you had that much time on your side. She thought about the watershed and the creek and the deer trails worn into the earth by so many generations of deer that they had become permanent features of the landscape. She thought about the creek crossing her property every year for 50 more years at minimum, fed by the watershed above it, cold and clear and full of the particular sound running water makes when it has enough room and enough time. She got up and put on her coat and went outside. She went to the back fence, she stood at the cedar post, and looked at the tree line, and breathed the cold April air, and let herself feel the full size of what had happened. It was not a small thing. It was a very large thing, and she had been so deep in the middle of it for so many months that she had not let herself think about it as a large thing because she had needed it to be a manageable thing. Now she let it be large. She heard him before she saw him, which was unusual. He typically moved without any sound she could identify, but she heard him this morning. Footsteps on the frost-hard path around the side of the barn. The ordinary human footsteps of someone who was not trying to be unheard. She turned. Cale came around the corner of the barn and stopped next to her at the fence. "You heard," she said. "Owen called," he said. She shook her head, but she was smiling. Owen, who had never mentioned Cale's name to her for months and months, and who had apparently been in contact with both of them all along, keeping his own counsel about the connections he could see that they could not. She owed him a very long conversation. 50 years, she said. At minimum, Cale said. They stood at the fence and looked at the trees together in the April morning, the sky above them pale and wide and beginning at the edges to suggest something warmer was coming. The creek was audible from here, running high with the snowmelt, full of the particular purpose water has when it has been freed from ice and is moving again. Mara had spent the winter doing things she had never done before, and she had done them because the land required them, and because Owen had told her they mattered, and because Clara had made it possible, and because Cale had spent 2 years laying groundwork she had not known existed. She had also done them because she had woken up every morning for 5 months, rested and clear-headed, and rooted in a way she could not attribute entirely to any single cause, and that quality of groundedness had made every hard thing of those months more possible. She knew now what part of that rootedness came from. Spring was committing itself, finally and fully, to the ridge. The birches at the edge of the north slope had gone pale green at the tips in the past week, a color so tentative, it was almost not a color at all, almost just a suggestion. The mud in the paddock was deep enough now that she had started laying temporary planks for paths, which was an annual event and one that she had come to think of as a genuine seasonal marker. The chickens were spending more time outside. The creek was doing its loudest work of the year. Cale had been at the homestead 3 or 4 times a week since February, and now that the county case was resolved, there was no practical reason for this frequency, and neither of them had suggested changing it. He brought things sometimes. The honey, which he had brought 4 times now. Once a bag of good coffee from the town that he had noted she was out of without making a production of having noted it. Once a particular kind of wood sealer he had found for the back porch boards that had been on her list since autumn. He was not showy about any of it. He brought things because they were needed, and he had noticed they were needed, and then he put them down and did not require acknowledgement. She was not accustomed to being provided for in this way. She had been so thoroughly her own provisioner for so long that she had stopped noticing the effort of it, the way you stop noticing the weight of something you have been carrying long enough. She noticed now, by contrast, what it felt like when some part of the weight shifted. She did not know how to say this exactly, so she said it the way she said most things she did not quite have the words for, by not saying it directly, but by showing it. She made dinner when he was there. She made it for 2 without being asked. She kept his tea preference in mind without making a thing of keeping it in mind. She showed him the journal entry about being watched over, the one she had written in early November before she understood what the watching was, and she watched his face while he read it, and what moved across his face was something she was still learning to read, but was learning. She showed him the found things folder on her computer one evening, the photographs she had taken of the post, of the fur, of the morning after the fire with the strands laid out across her work table. He sat very still while he looked through them. She had organized them chronologically and labeled each one with the date, and seeing them all together in sequence was different from experiencing them one at a time across 5 months. In sequence, they told a story she had been inside without being able to see its shape. "I didn't know you were photographing them," he said. "I didn't know why I was," she said. "It seemed important." "It was," he said. And then, quieter, "Thank you." She looked at him. "For photographing fur?" "For treating it like something worth documenting," he said. She understood what he meant. She understood that the documentation was a form of recognition, that it said, "This is real, this matters. I am not letting it go unwitnessed," which was exactly what he had been doing for her from the beginning, from the other side of the ridge, with his counting, and his surveys, and his quietly held attention. They were alike in this. She had thought it before, and she thought it again. They were doing the same work in different languages. May settled in warm and green and purposeful. Mara's spring list was long, as it always was, and she worked through it with the energy that comes after a winter survived. the animal satisfaction of warm weather and lengthening days, and the world producing again, instead of simply enduring. She repaired the paddock fence where the frost heave had shifted 2 posts. She planted her kitchen garden. She cleaned and repacked the chicken coop. She straightened the cedar post at the corner of the back fence, properly this time, with new concrete at the base, tamped and leveled, done correctly. Cale helped with the concrete. He did not need to be asked. She had stopped asking herself how she felt about him because she had answered the question months ago, and the answer had not changed and was not going to change. She knew her own mind. It was one of the things she was certain of about herself, that once she understood something clearly, she did not revise it simply because time had passed. She was steady in that way. She had always been steady in that way. What she was still learning was how to let it show. She had lived alone for 2 years and had organized herself around self-sufficiency so thoroughly that the habit ran deeper than she had realized. She was used to being the only person who knew what she needed. She was used to providing everything herself. Allowing someone else into the space where those things happened was slower than she had expected. She was patient with herself about this. She was patient about most things. He was patient too. Profoundly patient, in the way she was beginning to understand, was simply part of who he was. Not strategic patience, not the patience of someone waiting for the right moment to push, but genuine patience, born of having lived at the pace of things that did not rush. The ridge had its own pace. He had lived at the ridge's pace long enough to have taken on something of its quality. In the evenings they sat by the wood stove, which she still lit in May because the nights still wanted it, and she read or wrote and he did his own quiet things. He was a reader too, which she had been glad to discover, and he read with the same completeness he brought to everything, and the house had a quality in those evenings that she had not felt in a house before. Not the quality of a house with one person in it, not the quality of a house where someone had recently arrived or was about to leave. The quality of a house where 2 people were both entirely at home. She noticed one evening in late May that the pillow had migrated. She had moved it from the workroom to the bedroom in the weeks after the March conversation, in the quiet way she moved everything, without announcement. It was on the bed where it should always have been. She noticed, in passing, that it was on the bed, and that this was simply true, and simply right, and she went on with what she was doing. He noticed too. She could tell because his face did the thing it did when something mattered. A slight stilling, a particular quality of expression that she would not have been able to describe to anyone else, but could read clearly when she was in the same room with it. He noticed, and he did not say anything about it, and she did not say anything about it, and it was one of the things that was simply true between them now, adding itself to the collection of true things that had been building since October. One morning in early June, she woke before the light. She lay in the quiet dark and listened to the birds starting in the cedars, the first few tentative notes of the early risers that began before the sky had committed to anything. She could hear the creak. She could feel the warm weight of the pillow beside her, the accumulated months of it, all the strands she had gathered and worked in, all the mornings at the fence post, the entire slow record of 2 people moving toward each other from opposite sides of a ridge. Cale was asleep. She had not seen him fully asleep before. He was almost always awake first, which amused her in the way that small, consistent things amuse you when you have come to know someone's patterns well. But this morning, he had not woken first. He was asleep, and his face was completely open, in the way faces are open only in sleep, without any of the readiness that was usually there, the quality of a person who is always slightly attending to something. His hand was open on the pillow beside him. He was not counting anything. She could tell. She had learned to read his stillness the way she had learned to read the land, by looking long enough and honestly enough that what was on the surface stopped being all there was. There was a particular quality he had when he was tracking something, a slight inward attention, even in ordinary moments. She had seen it, and not understood it, and then understood it, and recognized it in retrospect, in moments going back months. He was always, at some level, accounting for things. Making sure, keeping record. Not now. Now he was just asleep. His face was open, and his hand was open, and the birds were going in the cedars, and the creek was running, and the light was beginning to come. She reached out and put her hand on the pillow between them. She thought about a cold October morning, and a warm handful of silver fur that should not have been warm. She thought about the instinct that had said, keep this, without any reason attached. She thought about braiding, which was the work of taking separate things and making them hold together, which was something she had always known how to do. She thought about what it meant that she had kept every strand, that she had built something from the keeping, that she had slept on it every night and been rested, and had not questioned where the rest came from until she had enough of the whole picture to understand. She thought about a man on the other side of a ridge counting. She thought about what it was to count the things that were taken, to say by the counting, I see that you received this, I see that it reached you, I see that what I tried to give was not lost. She thought about that as a form of care, and she thought it was one of the most careful forms of care she had ever encountered. The light came up slowly over the ridge. It came the way light came there, without hurry, without performance, just steadily and completely and in its own time. It found the window, and came across the floor, and reached the bed, and lay across the pillow, and her hand on it, and it was warm, even in June, the way warmth always is when it arrives after a long wait. Cale opened his eyes. He looked at her hand on the pillow. He looked at her face in the new light, and what was in his expression was everything she had learned to read in him, the steadiness, the attention, and underneath those things, the warmth that had been there from the beginning, patient as he was patient, present as he had always been present. Early, he said. The birds, she said. You always wake for the birds, he said. You know my habits, she said. I've been paying attention for a while, he said, and there was something in how he said it that carried everything, all of it, the months and the ridge and the fence post and the counting, and the long patient work of two people learning how to come toward each other without rushing anything and without leaving anything important behind. She smiled. She moved her hand from the pillow to his. She let it rest there in the new light, in the room that was warm, and hers, and his, with the creek running outside, and the birds going, and the ridge beginning another day above them. I know, she said. I've been paying attention too. He turned his hand over under hers. They lay like that for a while, in the June morning, in the home she had made and he had helped hold, and the pillow was between them, and the light was on everything, and the things between them now were not the careful held things of months ago, but the open, comfortable things of people who have decided to put their secrets down, and found that what was underneath them was simply this. Two people who had been watching over each other from the beginning, who had kept what mattered without being asked, who had counted and collected and held the line, and who were now, finally, in the same room in the daylight with nothing left to hold at arm's length. Later, she would try to write it in the journal and find that the right words were simple. She wrote, He counted every one. I kept every one. We were doing the same thing all along. We just didn't know yet that we were doing it for each other. Then she closed the journal and left it on the nightstand and went downstairs to make coffee, and he came down a few minutes later, and they stood together at the kitchen window, looking at the back fence and the tree line beyond it, all of it green and permanent and thoroughly, completely theirs. She did not check the cedar post that morning. She did not need to.